All right, if you guys could grab out your notes that say vertical and adjacent angles at the top. And it also says student handout too. So we're going to be spending a lot of time today talking about angles. Angles are formed or created, you could say they're formed or created when two lines intersect. And the word intersect means that they're going to cross. So you can see these two lines right here. We have a line X and we have line Y, and they are intersecting at this middle point right here. And right where they intersect, you can see it creates four different angles, angle A, B, C, and D. The very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use what's called a protractor to measure those angles. So I've got different protractors up at the front of the room, kind of by the rulers, if you want to each distribute those around, and maybe pause the video while you do so. Okay, so first thing with the protractor is you'll notice that there is this hole right here. Basically is signaling the very center of my protractor, and you'll also notice that there's this straight black line right here. That's going to help me to line. I'm going to line the center of my protractor up with right exactly that point where my lines intersect. And then I want to make sure you can see, like right now it's very crooked. This flat black line right here should lie flat on that line. And actually, before we even do that, one thing, if your protractor is as large as mine, you might want to use the edge of your protractor to kind of extend those lines a little bit, because mine actually do not go far enough for me to be able to measure the angles properly. So I've got those lines extended. I'm going to take the center and put it where those lines intersect. Line that flat line up there. That looks good. And the first thing I'm going to look at is angle A. So with angle A, you can see I'm going to follow this line out to 0 here. And I'm going to count up my protractor until I get to the spot where you can see my extended line right here is. Angle A is 10, 20, 30, 40. We're going to say about 50 degrees. So angle A is 50 degrees. And then when we go to do angle B, again, we're going to line that up at the center. Make sure that line is lined up. But this time from angle B, we're actually going to start from the right-hand side here. And so since we're starting from the right, we actually are going to use these inner numbers here. So angle B is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120, 130 degrees. So that's 130 degrees. And then I'm actually going to flip my paper completely upside down so that way I can figure out angles C and D. Line the center of my protractor up again. And angle C, I'm going to start over here on the left on the outer edge and go 10, 20, 30, 40. That one ended up being 50 as well. I'll label that as 50 degrees. I just realized I should be writing them over here. And then I'll line that up one more time. And for angle D, I'm going to go all the way to the right. Use my inner edge, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120, 130 degrees. And now I'm going to go ahead and fill in angle A is 50 degrees, B is 130 degrees, C is 50 degrees, and D is 130 degrees. So the first question here says, what do you notice about the angle measures? So I want you to just think about that for a moment. And what I'm noticing about my angle measures is my opposite angles. So angle A and angle C and angle B and angle D are congruent or equal to each other. So I'm going to go ahead and write opposite angles are equal. And then the second question says, what do you notice about the sum of the four angles above? So the word sum means to add. So go ahead and add up those four angles. So 130 degrees plus 130 degrees would be 260 degrees. 50 plus 50 is 100, and 260 plus 100 would be 360 degrees. So basically, as you go around in a complete circle, an entire circle here is 360 degrees. Let's go to this next portion here and talk about some vocabulary. So two types of special angles are formed when two lines intersect. We're going to use the picture above and the table to help you define and describe these types of angle pairs. So we have what are called vertical angles. So vertical angles are pairs of opposite angles formed by intersecting lines. Opposite angles formed by intersecting lines. So if I go back up to my diagram here, my opposite angles would be angle A and angle C. You can see those are both 50 degrees. Those are called vertical angles. So angle A and angle C are considered to be vertical angles. And sometimes I find it helpful to highlight both of those in yellow so you can easily see that. And then my other set of vertical angles would be angles B and D. Angle B and angle D. And when we're working with vertical angles, all vertical angles are congruent. So congruent means that they are equal to each other. Vertical angles are pairs of opposite angles, and they are congruent to one another. And then we also have what's called an adjacent angle. The word adjacent actually means next to, so it might help you to write the word next to above adjacent. It's pretty easy to remember, like my classroom is adjacent to Mrs. Anderson's classroom. So my classroom is next to Mrs. Anderson's classroom. And adjacent angles are two angles that share a common side. Kind of like if you think about Mrs. Anderson's room and my room, we share a common wall. And so adjacent angles share a common side, just like adjacent classrooms share a common wall. And a common vertex. And a vertex is that point that gets created when those lines intersect. So they share that vertex. So adjacent angles are angles that are next to each other. So if I go back up to my diagram here, I'm going to cover up the bottom half of my graph with my hand. And I can see that I've got two angles right here, angle A and angle B. Angle A and angle B are next to each other. They are adjacent angles. They share a common side, this angle right here, and they also share that vertex, that point in the middle right there. So angle A and angle B would be considered adjacent angles because they are next to each other. So we could say angle A and angle B. And if we turned our paper just like a quarter of the way, if I were to cover up the bottom half of my chart here, I could also say that angle B is adjacent to angle C. They're next to each other. They share that side and that vertex. If I flip my paper upside down, I could say that angle C is adjacent to angle D. They're right next to each other. They share that common side. And if I go about 3/4 of the way, I could see that angle A and angle D are adjacent or next to each other. So down here, we've only got room to list two of the pairs. I'm going to go ahead and add, since I already talked about how A and B are adjacent, I'm going to talk about how C and D are also adjacent to each other. Now, it's also important to talk about the relationship with adjacent angles. If we take a look at these adjacent angles right here, angle A and angle B, I want you to look at the sum of those angles. The sum of those angles would be 180 degrees. If I were to look at angles B and C, they're also adjacent. The sum of those angles, 130 plus 150, is also 180 degrees. If I were to look at C and D, 50 plus 130 is 180. And if I were to look at D and A, 50 plus 130 is 180. So when we're talking about the relationship of adjacent angles, we would say, let's see, sum of 180 degrees. So adjacent angles have a sum of 180 degrees. All right, in this bottom portion here, we're going to go ahead and put what we've just recently learned to the test. We have to use what you know about intersecting lines to label the missing angle in the picture below. So taking a look at problem number 1, I am noticing that this angle is 148 degrees and it is formed through 2 intersecting lines. I would say that since this angle is 148 degrees, x is 148 degrees. And then when it asks for the angle pair, it wants to know, how do you know that? Would those be considered vertical angles? Give me a thumbs up. Or would those be considered adjacent angles? Give me a thumbs down. So do you think that those are vertical or adjacent? Thumbs up for vertical, thumbs down for adjacent. Good, you should all be giving me a thumbs up. Those are considered vertical angles. Now for question number 2, my vertical angles would be this 35-degree angle and this angle right here. So we can't go with vertical angles, but I'm noticing that this angle right here, that's x degrees, and this angle here, that's 35 degrees. Those are right next to each other. Angles that are next to each other would be called adjacent angles. So I'm going to go ahead and write adjacent angles down here. And I want you to turn and tell your table partners, what is the sum of adjacent angles? What do they add up to? And you should have just told your table partner that the sum of adjacent angles is 180 degrees. So we know that 35 plus x has to equal to 180 degrees. So I'm going to take 180 degrees. I'm going to subtract that 35 degrees. And I'm getting 145 degrees left over for x. And you can flip to the next page. I'm going to start a second video.